Morning again. I am Palmer McIntyre with Piedmont Land Conservancy and Piedmont Legacy Trails. We welcome you this morning to our fourth and final Piedmont Legacy Trails Fall Conversation series. We're really glad you could join us today. We kicked off our series back in September with Chuck Blink speaking about the Greenway Imperative, followed by an update on all of our advocacy work with trail partners across the state to increase funding for trails. Then last time we had Amy Allison with the North Carolina Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry speaking about transforming rural economies. And today we are thrilled to host our friends and partners with the Greensboro Downtown Greenway to talk about planning and creating inclusive trails. So more about that in a few minutes. I want to gratefully acknowledge our sponsors. I'm going to share my screen here. I want to gratefully acknowledge our sponsors, the North Carolina chapter of the American Planning Association, Piedmont Triad Transportation Professionals, Arete Structures, Alta Planning and Design, and Duke Energy. They have made this whole series possible, so we're super grateful for their support. I'd also like to introduce our Piedmont Legacy Trails team. We have Brianna Hafferman, who is our full-time Piedmont Legacy Trails coordinator. You can say hello.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
And then we have Jesse Day with Piedmont Triad Regional Council.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Great to see you.
Great. Thanks. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We'll ask that you all stay muted for the presentation, but if you have questions, please go ahead and write those in the chat. We'll get to them either during the presentation or definitely after. We are recording the presentation, so we'll be sending out a link to everyone who registered for it so you can see it later and share it with friends. We'll also have a link on our website, piedmonttrails.org. And we do have credits for this, offering credits, planning credits, as well as PE credits. And you can see that information at the bottom of the slide, but it'll also be in the chat and it will be on our website. So make sure you can follow up with that. So now I'd like to introduce Dabney Sanders. Dabney is the project manager for the Greensboro Downtown Greenway. She has lived in Greensboro since the late 90s and has been an incredible community volunteer and of course, a tireless champion of the Downtown Greenway. And I'm gonna let her tell you all about that project. But she has assembled an amazing panel today to talk about how they intentionally planned and designed an inclusive project, and inclusive for traditionally marginalized neighborhoods and inclusive for people with disabilities. And I'll say without this pandemic and without the technology that we're using today, we would not be able to easily gather this group because they're coming from all over. So we're grateful for them tuning in today and for their time. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dabney. So I'm going to stop my share and Dabney is going to share her screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Palmer. I'm really excited to be here. And as I do my screen share, let's see. Great. Is that, can you see that? Perfect. I'm so happy to have brought this panel together, as Palmer mentioned. It's a treat. For one of the things I love about my job is the opportunity we have to interact with folks in the community, and I think we're going to share some great examples of how that has happened with the Downtown Greenway. As Palmer mentioned, we're going to talk about really two different sort of populations that we worked with. The first is the Warnersville community here in Greensboro. That was the site of the first leg of the Downtown Greenway that we built. And James Griffin, who is a member of that community, was really instrumental in his work with us and helping to open up doors in that community. So the second we're going to talk about is our Woven Works Park project, in which we worked with people with disabilities, and artist Randy Walker from Minneapolis, Minnesota is here on the panel with us. Randy designed that piece. And we also have Phelps Sprinkle, who is the parent of a child with disabilities. And Phelps was instrumental in helping Randy in his work to help determine the things that he needed to know and wanted to do with that particular site. Before we launch into that, for some of you on the call that maybe don't know about the Greensboro Downtown Greenway, I just want to run through quickly a little bit of the just what it is anyway, it's the Downtown Greenway is a 4-mile loop that you can see here in the center of this map. It defines our downtown of downtown Greensboro. It serves as the central hub of our entire trails and park system, both planned as well as existing trails and the signed bicycle routes that you see here highlighted in yellow. We are building this really for a number of reasons, certainly encouraging people to lead more active, healthy lifestyles, providing a means of transportation, economic development, which I'll talk about in a minute, and certainly connecting our communities. We're doing that through the use of an extensive program of public art. To just briefly talk about the funding, this is a $43 million project. It's being funded through a public-private partnership. Private funding through individuals, corporations, and foundations has contributed about $12.5 million to the project. And the remaining funds have come through public funds in the form of 2 bond referendums that the city of Greensboro put on the ballot that were overwhelmingly passed. One in 2008, which was a street improvement bond, and one in 2016, which was a Parks and Recreation bond. We then used that local public funding to then leverage additional funding from both NCDOT as well as federal transportation dollars. I mentioned the economic development piece of this. That was a really strong reason that Action Greensboro, the nonprofit organization that I work for, was interested in spearheading this project in partnership with the city. On this map, you can see these red circles really surrounding all parts of the Downtown Greenway that represent developments that have happened because of those places wanting to develop because of the presence of the Downtown Greenway. And we know that as we continue to build more of it, we will see those numbers increase. To date, we've seen over $502 million in private economic development. So this is sort of a little close-up map of the Downtown Greenway. I just wanted to point out the sections that are open. So here we are on the map that I was just describing to show you what is open. We have this whole entire southern section here, the section on the eastern side, Murrow Boulevard, coming up to join here is virtually complete. We're waiting for it to be finished up any week now. And then we have the rest of this northern section here open. So 3 of the 4 miles. That leaves us with this final mile along the western side. This was a former railroad bed that the railroad has been removed now. We have 100% plans for this particular section ready to go, and we will be putting this out to bid in early 2021. So it's exciting that we're getting towards the end of this project. We really started working on this actually back in 2001, so it's been quite a journey. But I want to really get into what we're here to talk about today, this equity and inclusion. And we're going to begin by talking about the Warnersville neighborhood, and that's this neighborhood down here in the south west corner here, the first section that we built called the 5 Points section, which is about 1/4 mile. And then after we finish talking about Warnersville, we're going to transition to talk about Woven Works Park, our innovation cornerstone, which is up here in the north east corner. So Warnersville. Warnersville was the first planned African-American neighborhood in Greensboro. In fact, it was Greensboro's very first organized neighborhood. A Quaker from Pennsylvania named Yardley Warner came to Greensboro shortly after the Civil War and just did not think it was right that Blacks could not own property in Greensboro. So he purchased 39 acres and hired a recently freed slave named Unthank to develop that neighborhood. And it was really an incredibly vibrant and thriving neighborhood for many, many years. You actually can see the neighborhood. This is downtown Greensboro here. It's just on the southern edge here where you see lots of trees here. In the 60s and 70s, urban renewal came through this community like it did in many communities, and it really destroyed the nature of that Warnersville community. You can see roadways built that really divided the community, an incredible loss of tree canopy. Lots of homes and businesses were destroyed during that process. And when we began to work with this Warnersville neighborhood, there was a lot of dissension in the neighborhood and a lot of distrust of other people coming into the neighborhood, as you can imagine, rightly so. And so we knew we wanted to be particularly careful about our conversations and engaging the community so that they would really feel like they were a part of helping to create this, and that we weren't just coming in telling them what to do. And so we held a series of community meetings in the Warnersville community. We used some consultants to help us with that. And we had 3 meetings. The first meeting, we literally did not talk about the Greenway at all. We talked about the neighborhood. We got the members of the neighborhood to talk to us about what stands out to them historically with respect to Warnersville. Are there people, places, or events that are particularly important to the neighborhood? And you can see all of these categories that were talked about. At the second meeting, it was really interesting. We had some people that had been to the first meeting, but then we had other people who joined for the first time. And the folks that had not been at the previous meeting came to the meeting with a little bit of a sense of distrust as well. And what we were thrilled to see was that some of the community members who had been at the first meeting actually did our job for us and brought the other community members up to speed. We then talked about kind of transitioned not so much to the history, but what are the activities and things that not only represent that legacy of the neighborhood, but that also will help us move forward. And the community, again, had these variety of categories of things that were important to them: home sweet home, progressive modernization, creative information, informative future for children, unity in the community, magnificent, significant, illustrious history, and safe and sound. And then at the third meeting is when we really began to talk about the Greenway, what it was, what it's not, what it can become, and let the residents really talk about what are these key sort of, we ended up calling them grains of sand that generate the Warnersville pearl. Some of those conversations led to the creation of this neighborhood bench, which was designed by Gary Gresco, who's from Oriental, North Carolina. And the words that he uses on this bench are the words that the Warnersville community actually came up with that they thought represented their community. We had a great ribbon cutting when we opened this particular section, which is called 5 Points. This is Angela Harris, who is a community member, along with a local middle school drumline and band that helped us do that in 2010. But I really want James to talk a little bit about his perspective as a Warnersville resident, and then really what followed after the opening of this section for the Warnersville community.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dabney, for that. As Dabney said, Warnersville, was a very large community with a lot of different organizations. So what the Greenway did was bring us all together to help us dialogue and come up with the things that made us in common with each other and the things that we wanted to represent. And what the Greenway has done since that time with the institution of the benches, which basically shows 5 points, which is a very important part of our community. The 5 points that the community came up with that really describes our neighborhood. But since that time, the Greenway really created what we call our points of pride. And since that point, we participated in the bicentennial 2008 Greensboro bicentennial. We created the Warnersville Historical and Beautification Society. And since that time, we've created a Shalonda Poole Memorial. 2014, we were able to create a Warnersville museum. And it went on to win state and national awards. In 2015, we became the first ever heritage community in the state. And as you see on the screen now, those are the 5 points that we put on the benches. And that is the theme that we use for our historical exhibit, museum exhibit, which was in conjunction with the Greensboro History Museum. So I would say that the Greensboro has not only developed points of pride for the community, but also since that time has created a lot of economic development. And we were even able to position ourselves with the new structures coming into the community, such as Union Square, Salvation Army, where we were able to exhibit items from the museum within these buildings. So it has been done very well for us and made us all proud of our community.
That's great. Thank you so much, James. So I wanted to just quickly point out a few other ways that we interacted with the Warnersville community. This is one of our cornerstone art pieces called Gateway of the Open Book, which was designed by Brower Hatcher from Providence, Rhode Island. Brower collaborated with a local artist, Frank Russell, to create the small embedments that you see up embedded in that mesh piece of the sculpture. Frank Russell had an art studio downtown, and he invited students from the Warnersville neighborhood that you can see here to visit his studio and learn a little bit about what it's like to be an artist, make a career as an artist. He then asked the students if they would draw ideas that came to them around the theme of motion, which was the theme of this particular cornerstone. It was looking at the fact that a series of railroads and highways came together, and also the fact that we have 7 colleges and universities here, the forward movement of people's minds. And so the kids drew these drawings of what they thought of when they thought of motion. And here you can see Peter's drawing of a bird that then Frank Russell interpreted using recycled North Carolina license plates to make those birds that then get embedded in Brower's sculpture itself. And then here you see the piece during the daytime with those embedded sculptures. It was a really incredible way to engage that community. And so when we did the opening here, you see Brower on the right, Frank Russell in the middle, and then Peter, who was one of these kids that lived in the Hampton Homes area of Warnersville, who had drawn that bird. And it was really Peter's first experience with public art. And you can just see from this picture how excited he is to be a part of this. We've continued to engage the Warnersville community on a regular basis. We have an annual event called Wheels on the Greenway, in which we get bicycles donated from the community. We have a group that does repair work and another company that donates helmets and does helmet fittings. And we take these bikes to the Warnersville Recreation Center for kids that need bikes. And then they ride about a half a mile from the rec center down to the Greenway and celebrate this day with us. And we've been doing this partnership for about 3 or 4 years now, and it continues to be really successful. So now we're gonna make a little transition to talk about Woven Works Park, which was the 3rd cornerstone we built. And I'm gonna let Randy and Phelps take this part away.
Okay. Thank you, Dabney. Phelps, you want to just cut in or do whenever? Maybe I'll say a little bit about Woven Works Park just as an introduction, and then we can kind of go from there.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, so Woven Works Park was a challenging project because it was not just a sculpture. It was a whole site that was intended to be inclusive and accessible for people of all ages and abilities. And it had an overarching theme of innovation, specifically as it related to the textile industry. But it's a 1.3 acre site, and it was a complete site design, including interactive sculpture, landscape elements, plant materials, everything. And so it was also, you know, its position on the Greenway, and the neighborhoods that it bordered were also part of the project as far as accessibility. So it was quite challenging. And I think as far as the accessibility and the opportunity for everyone to use this and to get something out of it was very interesting. It was also, I just want to say, so basically what happened was this theme of innovation as it related to textile specifically kind of drove the whole project. And what ended up happening was the design, from the small elements to the whole site design, sort of evolved from an idea of things, actions found within textile production. So weaving and spinning and twisting. I found this to be a way of kind of entering into this artistic expression that could be accessible to all. And we can talk specifically about how these issues were solved as far as coming up with something accessible. That was something new to me as far as that is concerned. So I could talk a lot. Maybe, do you want to say something, Phelps?
Yeah, Randy, I was going to say that like I want to. So my name's Phelps Sprinkle, as Dabney said, and I have a daughter with special needs who's now 18. I was looking back at some of these notes from when we did this. It was 6 years ago, and she just turned 18. And one of the things that Dabney and Randy asked was, they brought me and several other parents and or providers in the disability community together to talk about sensory integration and to talk about the needs of adults and kids, especially with this regard to this project. And what sensory means, you know, how we experience the world. So we all experience the world differently. We're all on some kind of spectrum around how we engage our senses and use our senses. And adults and children with sensory integration disorder, or, you know, and a lot of people know kids, people with autism and other types of intellectual and developmental disabilities do have a lot of sensory challenges, and so they experience the world in a very different way. And you know, so they were asking us questions like, how do you think my daughter's nonverbal, how does she experience the world? So it gave us an opportunity to really think that through and to talk about things like light and texture. For example, my daughter, if the sun's out, she'll do this, and we've never understood why she does it. And so I told Randy about that, for example, and that we think that is a way of how she's playing with the light, and that's actually interesting to her from an eye, that way her eyes engage with that. And then we talked about texture and how she likes to use her hands to touch and feel things. We talked about cause and effect, having control over your environment. A lot of people who have disabilities don't feel like they have control. And so we talked about a lot of those things, and I won't go into much more detail on that, but Randy incorporated that. We went and did some visits of other places. And I was just really impressed with the way Randy and Dabney and the team wanted to take this as a very holistic way of looking and creating something that could be transformative and could be really engaging for all people, not just for people with disabilities. But if you start there, you're going to create a much more inclusive space.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phelps. Randy, do you want to run through and maybe just explain what people are seeing on the screen, and we can run through a couple of other slides that show some of those specific elements? Sure.
So basically, I had a blank site to start with, and I was I felt like thrown into a very challenging situation, a huge blank slate. And so there needed to be some organization to the site if it was to have a number of sculptures that were to be experienced. And so what I did is just, the site is organized like a piece of cloth. So there's a warp and there's a weft. If you imagine a woven, actually a simple woven piece of cloth. It's actually a twill weave, like a piece of denim cloth. So there's a blue and a white thread, and a grid of threads that became paths and landscaping and sculptural elements placed within this woven cloth. So that's how the site is organized. What you're seeing here, there are 6 interactive elements within the site, and they're anchored by this. What you're seeing is the Revolution cone, and it's a reference to weaving, yarn. It's a reference to the Cone Brothers Mills. It's also what it is there's a spiral path that leads up slightly to a kind of a central rotating carousel bench that's got a 0 clearance with the surroundings, so it's accessible. You sit on the bench, which is kind of referencing thread. It's blue, the indigo blue, and you can look at that and spin the bench. It's kind of just like those old school playground carousels, and you can watch the city. You're facing outwards towards the city and the neighborhood, and if you look up, you can see these cables, 101, I believe, cables that go up and are held at the top of this spindle. And as you're rotating, it appears as though they're winding along a bobbin. And so that's kind of the central element, but this is accessible, and it's kind of a universal experience in addition to being a specific experience. And I think just in general, that when I met with Kate and Phelps and Roxie, I had the big realization, and others, I had a big realization that not to kind of focus on a specific need of a specific disability, but the more general I made the experiences, the more accessible, the more interesting they got. So basically, what can be imagined and what wasn't specific, if that makes any sense. These are some other elements on the site. Up in the top right, this is a salvage sandbox, and all it is a round circular sandbox, and there's an arm that's on a bike wheel that you can push. It can be pushed, it's at a height so that somebody in a wheelchair could push it, small children could push it, or an adult could push it, and you spin it around, and it's like a Zen garden. But the action of the sand going through the tines is very much, it was inspired by the thread going through the draper looms in the actual white oak mill when it was around. It's also a reference to the Greenway using bike wheels. But you can also sit down on a bench next to it and watch people using it. Up in the top left-hand corner, it's called the spool donor wall. And we had a need for recognizing donors to the Greenway. And instead of making just a traditional wall, we decided to do something interactive. So these are representing spools, and on each color of spool, there's a different level of donor, and they're called out with labels. There's also a separate key, so you can go to the key, the legend, and then look back at the spools and then spin them around. It's kind of inspired by not only the spools in the mill, but a Tibetan prayer wall that you could come by and spin these things. In the bottom left corner, all you're seeing is benches that have stools. There are 4 benches. They spin, and they are accessible along the path, so they're at an accessible height. These were inspired by spinning as well in the textile industry, but they were also inspired by the civil rights the sit-ins at Woolworths, and this is something that we got from meeting with neighbors. And this is valid and innovation and relevant to the theme of spinning and thinking. So there are two sets of these. They're called sit and spin, and they're intended to bring people into conversation and provide kind of a conversation point within the park. And then lastly, on the right bottom, you see the hop. This is the hops garden. What is this? This is the
hops garden.
hops garden. So it's a way. This is kind of a nod both to the textile industry in that there are these cables draped along this kind of frame-like structure, but it's also which then support actual hops plants, because hops and microbrewing at the time was innovative as far as the commerce of Greensboro. But there's also a hopscotch pattern painted along through it. So again, we got more. So this is along the Greenway here, and there are bike racks that are again inspired by the looms and the actions that are used to create spin the yarn within the mill. There you can see the spool donor wall beyond, and in this photo you can see some of the landscaping has come in, and again these landscaping beds conform to this idea of the denim weave. But when we're
No, go ahead.
So we're using we're using paths here, we're using light, color, movement, and these things I found most promising because they could be experienced again in a general way they seem to be experienced by old, young, people with disabilities. And that was kind of the big realization for me, because immediately when I started trying to conceive of this and design it, I was thrown into a world of specifics, very specific things, heights, radiuses, bolt lengths, and and products, frankly, that were already pre-designed specifically for people with disabilities, say. And my realization was that this could be more by being less, because people are also bringing their own imaginations, their own ways of thinking, their own sensory abilities to it. And to leave that open was really the key.
Dabney, can I say one thing as well about,
Please. Yeah.
about his approach? The attention to detail, the real intentionality on every aspect of this really blew me away. Randy was talking about numbers and sizes and standards that exist in the world that don't necessarily fit for people who are along a spectrum of some kind, who have differences. And I really appreciated that, especially, there's a budget, right? And it's a lot easier to get stuff off the shelf than it is to create something from scratch. And but there's so many different aspects, and I could talk about one small one that a detail that Randy put into this is there's several places along that pathway where you'll see just some bumps, some very minor cutaways, so that if you were to roll a bike or a wheelchair or a wagon or anything like that across it, it would be like like when you're on the highway and you get off the road a little bit and you hit the right side and it makes that sound that on your tires, that kind of sound. Well, I had told him when we were talking about Roxie, my daughter, as well as some other kids that I know with disabilities, that was something that really gave them pleasure, that bouncing or bumps or unexpected surprises really made her happy, for example. So I know when we're on the highway, I'll do that intentionally sometimes so that my daughter experiences that and it'll make her laugh. And so when we got to the park and saw the finished product and he had put some of those in there, it was an example of just the power of attention to detail, because when we ran her across it, sure enough, she laughed and thought it was great. So just a lot of intentionality around making this a very inclusive space. that really works for everybody. You wouldn't even notice it if you walked across it yourself, but an adult or child with disability totally gets a thrill out of it.
Oh, that's great, Phelps. Thank you for sharing that. I think we are about at the time for us to open it up for questions. And I hope you'll ask any of the four of us questions. I'm going to stop my screen share just so that we can see you all and can take a look at the chat. And Brianna, if there are any immediate questions you think we should address, let me know. I'm seeing, so I see Brianna's asked the use of the Greenway in the Warnersville neighborhood, and has it grown over time? And I would say yes, it absolutely has. We do track our trail use. We have counters, and we are seeing, of course, during this COVID time, we're seeing incredible increases in trail use, like so many trails across the country. But even outside of that, we were seeing that usage grow. We are, when we look at the times of day and the days of the week that people are using the trails, we know that people are using it both for recreation, but also as a means of transportation, which is what we had hoped for. So I think that's valuable. And I would say, yes, the Warnersville neighborhood embraced the trail from the beginning. After we sort of got through those initial conversations where there was some distrust and contention about the about outside people coming in with an idea, we really built that trust with the neighborhood. And I have to give James Griffin credit. He was a part of a kind of a subset of the neighborhood that really, I think, saw the value of the Greenway in the neighborhood, and they wanted to embrace it, and they worked really hard to communicate with other folks in the neighborhood and bring other people on board. Let's see. I'm trying to scroll up to see some of these questions we missed. So here's a question. How did you go about finding the artist to design the artistic pieces? And did you have a kind of master plan for the art for the overall project? Yes, we did have a plan from the beginning. Cooper Carey Center for Connective Architecture was the firm that did the original master plan for the Downtown Greenway. And they envisioned these 4 cornerstones that would mark the 4 corners of the trail, and each of those would have a citywide theme that was important in Greensboro's development. So the first cornerstone I pointed out, Gateway of the Open Book, with the theme of motion, I mentioned. Of course, Randy has talked about the innovation cornerstone, Woven Works Park, with looking at those innovative businesses, particularly the textile industry. In the northwest corner of the Downtown Greenway, we have the tradition cornerstone and a piece there called Meeting Place that was designed by Harry's and Hayter Collaborative out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that theme, tradition, it was kind of looking up towards the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and thinking about the role that Greensboro played in the Revolutionary War. And then the final cornerstone, which is under design right this minute, is in the southeast corner at the intersection of Gate City Boulevard and Murrow Boulevard. And the theme of that is freedom. Of course, it's looking at the role that Greensboro played in the national civil rights movement with our local sit-in movement here. And artist Radcliffe Bailey from Atlanta is designing that piece. And he's in the midst of it right now. We hope we'll have a design from him by the end of the year. We have an art selection panel that works on commissioning these pieces. They help us put the calls together, review the applications, and then shepherd really that whole process. And that panel consists of a number of art professionals, but also community members and folks from the city of Greensboro. In addition to those cornerstone pieces, we also have benches. You saw the Warnersville bench as an example. We commissioned North Carolina artists for each of the neighborhoods in which we pass through. And in those cases, we actually pick the artists, and then the artist does community meetings with the neighborhoods to learn, just like you saw that we did with Warnersville, both the history, but also the vision that those neighborhoods have for themselves moving forward. And then we have a couple of other pieces that we have a couple of pieces actually that were not part of the original kind of master plan for art, but they were just opportunities that really presented themselves to us that we felt like we could not pass up. In the Moorhead Park section over on the west side, kind of the southwest corner, we cross under the North Carolina Railroad line. We did a wonderful piece called Over Underpass with local artists, Jim Gallucci, and a lighting designer, Scott Richardson. We're working right now on a piece that's literally being installed. It's been worked on the last couple of weeks by a Raleigh-based artist, Thomas Sayer. And Thomas is doing this piece called West Woods, where he does monumental earth castings. And it's spectacular. I can't wait for it to be finished and everybody to enjoy that. So we had a basic structural plan, but then we were also open to opportunities that presented themselves along the way. So we've got a question: what were some of the challenges with engaging the Warnersville community, and how did you build trust? I would love, James, maybe to flip that question a little bit and let you talk about that, your perspective of how the Greenway folks were able to gain the trust of some of the Warnersville community. And you're on mute. Yep.
Yeah, like we said, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, like we said earlier, Warnersville was a large community with different groups with different ideas. So to have us all in one room, we were able to build trust based upon our common history of being the first planned community in the city of Greensboro. And so what the group was able to do was bring out everybody's point of view of what they personally felt about Warnersville and be able to grab it all together so that we all could have pride in moving forward and Greensboro and Warnersville becoming the first leg of the Greenway. So the way they did it was basically just to get everybody's ideas. They didn't show any favoritism, but just to make sure that everybody's idea was important. So that was really the catalyst of how they did it. And of course, we worked together as a group to make it happen. Yes, that's it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Mm-hmm.
One question: are there any unique funding opportunities for recreation for people with disabilities? And I have to say, I can't answer that question. Phelps, do you have any insights there?
Sure. Unique funding opportunities. I'm not sure if I would put it that way, but I will say that the city of Greensboro is making a very intentional effort to engage the disability community in their master plan, and in the way they design parks, either existing parks or creating new parks. I've personally been part of conversations with in the city manager's office and Parks and Rec, ongoing conversations around ideas. One that we're exploring pretty heavily right now, and even looking at a couple of sites that are existing that the city owns, is to create an adult sensory gym. The idea actually came from a parent of an adult child with autism, a pretty strong case of autism, and there just not being any real opportunities for adults with disabilities from a programming standpoint. When they go to a regular playground or park, the parents of children were afraid, to see an impulsive adult around them. And so even though inclusion is always the goal, what if we designed a gym that would be specifically created for adults with disabilities, but would also be for everybody, but it would be created first for them. So there's a lot of great ideas going around for that. And it's going to be, the location we're looking at is actually in a very accessible spot for the triad, and would be really accessible to UNCG and their program. It's a partnership potentially where they train people in their community and therapeutic recreation department. Our assistant city manager, Chris Wilson, is actually a graduate of that. And so that has a big impact on the way we look at disability, but it'll be a really cool partnership between the city and UNCG and some private funders.
Phelps, a quick question for you. Does that gym have a name at this point? Still being developed?
It's still being developed. You know, adult sensory gym is a term I've been using, but that's not what it'll be called. It does not have a name at this point, but I'd be happy to connect with you offline and talk to you more about that project. And again, I don't want to say just that's the only thing. There are lots and lots of ideas. One of the ideas would be this would also be a training center for Parks and Rec staff to then be more aware of inclusion, so that when they go to their parks where they work, they will be more mindful of those needs to be more inclusive in the way they design things, the way they talk to people, the way they work with people. So very powerful project.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
I also see we had a question about how Wovenworks Park ties into the Greenway. So Wovenworks Park is in the northeast corner. It's at the intersection of, for those of you that know Greensboro, of Murrow Boulevard and Lindsay Street. And the Downtown Greenway will run directly adjacent to Wovenworks Park. It actually has been, that piece of it has been built and is paved now. We're really just waiting for sort of the final bits of that contract to be finished before we officially open it up. But there's a direct connection there. So the Greenway runs along the east side of Murrow Boulevard, and then Wovenworks Park is directly adjacent there. Okay. Any other questions?
This is Jesse with the Piedmont Triad Regional Council. I just, hopefully you can hear me. Just in this time of COVID, it's a good question in terms of how this inclusivity and equity is incorporated into the planning processes. I just wondering, with any current projects that Randy or James are working on, you know, what have you seen that works well in kind of this difficult environment we're in?
It's a difficult environment for an artist, and working with projects that are in the public realm in any capacity. For me, I don't know if you guys have any experiences current. James,
You're muted.
I would say as a community, it's very difficult to really get the community together to try to spread the pride and those types of things within each other. So the Zoom calls, they work okay, but you know, COVID has definitely hampered our ability to get together and promote other items at this point.
Yeah, I think from a public art standpoint, a lot of the projects that I work on have some kind of pretty heavy community engagement, and I'm working on a few right now where that's been very challenging. And I agree, the Zoom things they're better than nothing, I suppose, but it's really difficult because the actual interaction and sometimes doing drawings, it just can't be translated digitally, I don't think.
Yeah, just I guess the question is like, is it unequitable to, you know, push forward through that when your engagement can't be, I guess, complete, for lack of a better word, you know? So
I think so.
Is it better to wait until we're through this thing, or do we keep planning and pushing through? That's one thing, you know, I'm seeing as a challenge with our regional planning projects.
I definitely think that it excludes a lot of people from the process in terms of the projects I'm working on, that although I would love to move a project forward, I personally have come to the conclusion that to not try to push it through. I mean, it's just not, it's not the same.
And I would say, Jesse, for us, it's been kind of a double-edged sword, I guess. In many ways, I would absolutely agree with Randy that we are not able to do the community engagement in the traditional ways that we have in the past, and we've had to look at doing that a little bit differently, encouraging smaller groups. It requires a little more kind of one-on-one communication with folks. On the other hand, because we have moved some of our educational opportunities and our community engagement online, it actually has allowed for much greater participation than we would have ever had without it. So we're seeing numbers, for instance, you know, in when Radcliffe Bailey did his kind of community engagement meeting, one of his community engagement meetings, we had over 500 people that participated in that and were able to see that, which in an in-person meeting, we would not get those numbers of people coming to an in-person meeting. So I really see it both ways. I think you have to work a little differently and a little harder to make it work.
Yeah.
That's true.
So I see another question that's popped up. Is there a creek flowing through Woburn Works Park, and is that incorporated in the park? There is a stream that is piped through much of the park and then daylights. And Randy, do you want to talk a little bit about that stream piece?
The stream. Yeah, well, it's not a pastoral creek that I thought when I first saw it. Oh, you know, there's a beautiful stream. It is a drainage for the city, so sometimes it's more full, sometimes it's more empty. It's also protected. It's also significantly below the surrounding grade, so it's very challenging to incorporate that into the design because of its limitations. It was never something where there was going to be, you know, a place where you would go down and play and look at, you know, sit on a little dock and look at it, or because really it was inaccessible. So it took a long time to solve that and to integrate it into some kind of holistic way. So essentially what happened is that we made a pollinator, a bird, bee, and butterfly garden with native species around it, being that it was inaccessible and that the levels were changing and there were restrictions around it anyway. So that was a great experience too, because it's largely designed, for instance, species were suggested and by the Audubon group, for instance, and it's, to my knowledge, it's maintained by a group of volunteers on a fairly regular basis. And I think there's an educational component to it as well, explaining species and how that's affecting. Is that pretty?
Yeah. Yeah, we do have a group of volunteers that particularly from the local Native Plant Society, that have taken a real interest and ownership of that. They do about 4 to 6 work days a year. It's a challenge to maintain, as anybody who's ever planted a wildflower garden. It's not as easy as you might think, but it has certainly been a huge enhancement to that particular area.
Well, we're a little over on time, but we probably have time for one more question if there's any questions that have been spurred on in this discussion. What a great discussion. You can actually unmute here if you like. It looks like we've answered hopefully most of the questions in the chat box, correct?
I think so, yeah. And I want to again apologize so much for our tech difficulties earlier, but I'm glad we finally figured it out and you stuck with us.
We powered through. Well, I want to thank Phelps, Randy, James, and Dabney for a great discussion today, and we'll wrap it up there, and I'll just do some closing comments here. So that does round out our fall conversation series with Piedmont Legacy Trails, and hopefully you can take some of the information that you've learned, whether it's on the Greenway Imperative or regional and local or state advocacy or tourism, and what we've learned today about equity and inclusivity, and share it broadly with friends and family at Thanksgiving and beyond. These recordings will be available on the Fall Conversation Series. And we would love to hear your feedback. Brianna will follow up with an email and a survey following today's meeting to attendees here today and all the Fall Conversation Series to get some feedback on what future conversations should look like. We're not sure what we're going to do in terms of a spring conference at this point. We'll see how this pandemic rolls through as we get a vaccine, hopefully in the near future. But we'd like to hear your feedback just on topics that would be of use in your day-to-day, whether you're building trail, planning trail, or working on the policy side and advocacy. But just as a reminder, Piedmont Legacy Trails, our purpose is to share resources, build capacity, provide useful information, ideas on trail experiences and going forward. So we have a steering committee. So there's a few folks on here that are involved in that steering committee that do the kind of the week-to-week work and help advise Brianna, myself, and Palmer on strategic direction for Piedmont Legacy Trail. So if anyone's interested in that, just reach out to one of us three, and we'd love to get your feedback and involvement in that steering committee. It's kind of a compass for us as we work on the day-to-day stuff with Piedmont Legacy Trails. So thanks for your involvement, and I hope you have a safe and restful Thanksgiving week.